Okay, so now in the last lecture we looked at the labor market, which determines employment, production function, which determines the level of output, and we said that the quantity theory of money is the theory that determines prices, or the explanation of what determines the price level for the neoclassical theory. Okay? Now, finally we're going to get to Say's law, which determines the level of expenditure. We'll see where expenditure comes in at that time, but remember I stated when we were first learning about the macroeconomic approach in week 1, right, the first lecture, that the three main variables that all economic schools are concerned with, any macroeconomic school is concerned with talking about or explaining what they believe determines output, employment, and prices. So now we're going to get to the price level, okay? As I mentioned, quantity theory of money is the component of the neoclassical model that determines the price level, okay? Now, the quantity theory of money in and of itself is this equation, MV equals PY, okay? MV equals PY. I'm going to start off by saying MV equals PY, and I'll explain what they all are, what the variables stand for in a second. It is an identity. An identity is something that's true by definition, such as 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? It's true by definition. I agree that MV is equal to PY. What I disagree with, okay, and non-neoclassical economists would disagree with this, what we disagree with is the assumptions and causality that was introduced into the quantity theory of money, okay? You can almost consider this Milton Friedman's quantity theory of money, okay? He's the one who came up with this sort of idea in the most recently, okay? So, this is also, and I'm going to go through it when we get to it, this is why you hear some pundits on TV saying, oh, Obama's increased the money supply, there's going to be hyperinflation, okay? What they're using is this particular theory. Remember, inflation and hyperinflation is when prices rise. Hyperinflation is when prices rise a lot, very rapidly, okay? Well, the quantity theory of money explains what determines the price level. At least neoclassicals believe this is what determines the price level. So therefore, if you determine the price level, it contains the explanation of inflation. So this is the neoclassical theory of inflation, okay? And it's why a lot of people thought the Obama bailouts and the stimulus were going to cause hyperinflation. Now, that never happened, so maybe there's some problems with this theory. We'll see, okay? But it's been 5 years now since the bailouts and the stimulus, right? It's 2014, and we're still waiting for hyperinflation as if it's right around the corner. Well, it's been 5 years. Inflation happens or it doesn't happen. It didn't happen, okay? So, let's take a look at the quantity theory of money, and then we're going to proceed to Say's law, okay? So, the quantity theory of money, MV equals PY, okay? MV equals PY. M stands for the money supply, the amount of money that is in the U.S. economy, okay? That's the money supply. All the money that I have, that you have, that everyone has, the total money supply, that is M. V stands for velocity, okay? Velocity. It is the speed at which a dollar turns over. Excuse me. So, what do I mean by velocity? The speed at which a dollar turns over. If I was to go outside, go to 7-Eleven, and I buy a Slurpee, right, I hand the clerk $1 for my Slurpee. Then, if he decides to go across the street and get a slice of pizza, he hands that dollar over to the pizzeria owner. Now, if the pizzeria owner decides to go have a beer, he hands that dollar over to the bartender, okay? It's how fast a dollar is changing hands, how quickly it turns over, okay? So V is the velocity of money. It's how quickly a dollar turns over, how frequently it changes hands. P is the price level. Okay? It determines, this is the price level. It's the general level of prices in the economy. Finally, Y is the level of output, okay, or income. It's the level of output in the economy. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, MV equals PY. That's true. It's an identity. Okay? But the neoclassicals introduced some assumptions into this equation that sort of get it to say what they want it to say. Okay? It helps them say, well, this is what determines prices, clearly. These assumptions are what I and many other economists have a problem with. Okay? We take an issue with it. Anyway, for now, the neoclassicals assume that the government controls the money supply. Okay? That the government controls the money supply. We're not going to get into it now. We'll get into it in week 6, but this is a very problematic assumption. The government does not control the money supply. The government sets interest rates. They don't control the money supply. As much as they would like to, they don't. Banks create money all the time. In fact, a recent paper by the Bank of England just said that, exactly that. Okay? However, we're going to assume that the government controls the money supply. Okay, so the government controls the money supply, and I'm going to make a little S next to M for money supply. Okay? It's the total amount of money in the economy. Okay? Second assumption, velocity is constant. Okay? They assume that the velocity of money is constant. That is, it's always turning over at the same rate. Okay? Money is always changing hands at the same exact pace. Whether it's 2005, 2010, or 2014, money is always changing hands at the same exact rate. So the velocity of money is constant. Okay? Third, we assume that we are at the full employment level of output. Okay? Why do we assume we're at the full employment level of output? Well, if you remember from the first part of the neoclassical lecture, right, the first part of week 3's lecture, with the production function, well, with the labor market, we said that we have full employment in the labor market. And then when we got to the production function, we said that since capital is the desired amount of capital, right, we have the exact amount of capital we want, and we have full employment, well then the production function tells us that we must be at the full employment level of output. Okay? So we had y in our production function, and we turned y into yf. Okay? So we're going to do that here. We're going to take y, the level of output, and say that it is the full employment level of output. Okay? If something is at the full employment level of output, then that means it's constant, right? If you're always producing as much as you can possibly produce, then you can't be producing any more. That level is constant. So therefore, YF is constant. Okay? So, government controls the money supply, the velocity of money is constant, and the full employment level of output is constant as well. Okay, so how do we get inflation then? Or what determines prices? Well, if this is constant and this is constant, the only thing that can make prices go up is if the government prints too much money. Okay? Neoclassicals believe that the government printing money, the amount of money they print, will determine the price level. Okay? That's what determines the price level in the macroeconomy. So if prices are low, right? If prices are low, then the government hasn't printed enough money. Okay? Because if this is small, then this will be small. Because remember, these are both constants. Those are constant. So if this is small, then this will be small. On the other hand, if this is large, this will be very large. Okay? We call large prices inflation, right? It's when prices go up a lot. So if the government prints too much money, because remember, we're assuming the government controls the money supply. So if the government prints too much money, then prices are going to go up a lot. So a lot of neoclassical economists believe that inflation is caused by printing too much money. Okay? This is what we saw in 2008 and 2009 with the Obama bailouts and the stimulus, right? Neoclassical economists were all huge proponents of saying that these bailouts and these stimulus bills were going to cause inflation. They said hyperinflation. Why did they believe that? Because they thought the government was printing so much money that this was going to increase a lot, which would cause this to increase a lot. And if prices increase a lot, that is hyperinflation. Okay? So that's where you got this idea from, okay? That there was going to be inflation in 2010, 2011, 2012. We're at 2014, it hasn't happened. Okay? But this is the quantity theory of money, and this is what neoclassicals say determines the price level in the economy. Okay? So that's number 3 here. The quantity theory of money determines the price level. Okay? You need in order to discuss the quantity theory of money, you need these 3 assumptions and this equation. And then you can tell me what determines the price level in the economy and what causes inflation, what neoclassicals believe causes inflation. Okay? Now we're going to move on to Say's law. Say's law is made up of 2 separate equations, and you can summarize Say's law as supply creates its own demand. Remember, Say's law is responsible for the level of expenditure. Okay? Now, before I get to, it's what neoclassicals say determines the level of expenditure. Now, before I get to what actually is Say's law and the equations, we need to see why the level of expenditure matters, right? I mean, in the first lecture, I told you that macroeconomists care about 3 things: employment, output, and prices. Well, what do we need to explain expenditure for? And this is a rhetorical question, of course. What do we need to explain expenditure for if we already have something that tells us what determines employment, we have something that tells us the level of output, and we have something that determines the price level? Right? If we have all those 3, then why in the world would we need to talk about expenditure? Okay? Well, there's a very simple answer for that. We mentioned that in the neoclassical labor market, the level of employment is going to be the full employment level. Now, not everyone may actually be employed, right? It's sort of that little trick they pull with the labor-leisure trade-off, where everyone who is willing to work at that current wage has a job, but if you're not willing to work at that wage, you're lazy, and you choose leisure, then they're going and sitting on the couch. Okay, well that's full employment, and that's fine if you believe it. That's the theory for the neoclassicals, okay? What they still could run into a problem with is this. let's say 10 people have a job, right? And they are paid $1 each. We're going to make this very simple, okay? So I'm the boss and there's 10 workers. I pay each worker $1 each. These are people who are not lazy, they're not sitting on the couch playing Xbox. They are willing to work hard for the going wage, right? They fit the neoclassical labor market exactly, okay? So they're not choosing leisure, they're choosing to labor. So I pay each of these 10 people $1 each. So my cost is $10, okay? Well, let's say I pay out my $10 and I make pizza. Well, only 6 of them decide to buy pizza, right? So I get $6 back, okay? Well, that means I'm still out $4, right? I paid out $10, I had $10 worth of costs, and I only got $6 back. I received $6 worth of revenue. My revenues were lower than my costs, okay? That means that I am losing money as a company, right? My pizza company is losing money. I pay out more than I receive back. So what happens if people decide to save, right? Because I paid out $10, but I only received $6 back. If people decide to save, then what ends up happening is, since my company's losing money, I might have to fire someone, right? I'm going to fire the least productive workers, whomever, but the problem is, here's someone who was willing to work at the current wage level, right? They were hardworking. They were willing to work for $1, right? They were the model of choosing labor over leisure, okay? They wanted to work for $1 per hour. And yet, because they decided to save, or it could even be that one of their colleagues decided to save, they are now out of a job, okay? Which means they are now unemployed. Despite the fact that they're willing to work for $1 an hour, they are unemployed because of savings, right? This could be a major problem for the neoclassical model, right? The neoclassicals say, if you're hardworking and you're willing to save and be studious, then you will always find a job and you'll be employed, right? Only lazy people are unemployed. Well, it turns out that these people in my pizza company, some of them are going to be unemployed even though they're working for $1 an hour, simply because a colleague decided to save, right? I paid out $10, but I only got $6 back, so I'm going to have to fire someone. Herein lies a problem. We need an explanation of what expenditure is. Okay? We need to talk about spending. Expenditure is spending. This is where Say's law comes in, where supply creates its own demand. Okay? There are 2 equations that make up Say's law. And you can find these on the PowerPoint for the neoclassical model as well. The first equation of Say's law says this. Okay? What this is saying is that income Y is equal to consumption. Consumption, which is a function of the interest rate. Okay, so how much you choose to consume, right? Consumption is pizza, beer, hot wings, Slurpees, things like that. How much you decide to consume is a function of the interest rate. So every time you're about to buy a pizza, you actually look at the interest rate and see what it is and whether or not you should buy a pizza or if you should decide to save it. S stands for savings. Savings is also said to be a function of the interest rate. Okay? So, if you put this together, consumption plus savings, you get total income. And that's correct. If you take all the money that people consume plus all the money people save, then you end up with total income. Okay? Consumption is said to be negatively related to the interest rate. Okay? It's negatively related. So what that means, negatively related, it's like our law of demand. One goes up, the other goes down. Okay? So if the interest rate goes up, then consumption goes down. That's what we're saying here. Okay? Consumption is negatively related to the interest rate. Savings is positively related to the interest rate. Okay? The more the interest rate goes up, the more people will want to save. That's what Say's law tells us. It's what they believe. So, that's positively related. Okay? Say's law says, the first equation in Say's law says that consumption is a function of the interest rate plus savings, which is a function of the interest rate, is equal to income, and that consumption is negatively related to the interest rate and savings is positively related to the interest rate. Okay? The second equation in Say's law is that investment is also a function of the interest rate. Okay? Investment is a function of the interest rate, and that is a negative relationship. Okay? In other words, the more the interest rate goes down, the more investment goes up, and vice versa. Okay? That's what this is saying. The interest rate goes up, investment goes down. The interest rate goes down, investment goes up. So investment is negatively related to the interest rate. So if the interest rate goes down, more people are going to build factories, right? Investment. They're going to build Ford factories and pizza factories, things like that, okay? Now, let's go back to my example where there was 10 workers, okay? And when I had the 10 workers that I paid $1 each, I paid $10 out, but I only received $6 back. Okay? That means all of them saved $4 total. Okay? So they consumed $6. Right? I paid out 10, but only 6 was consumed. The other $4 were saved. Okay? I think you can see it. I just want to make sure you can see it. Okay. So the $10 I paid out to my workers. They consumed 6. Well, now I need a way to get that $4 back, right? I need the $4 back, or else I'm going to start firing people. And I don't want to fire people because the economy is always at full employment, right? If I had to fire someone, that means they would become unemployed despite the fact they were willing to work for $1 a day, right? They're hardworking, they're studious, they are exactly what we want in society, right? They were willing to work at a given wage, and they weren't going to go leisure, okay? If I end up firing that worker simply because people decided to save, that means capitalism is no longer socially harmonious, okay? What I mean there is, remember, social harmony, socially harmonious. I said, if you're willing to work hard and save, you will get ahead, right? If you will work at this going wage, then you will have a job. No ifs, ands, or buts. Okay? So, if you are a hard worker, you persevere, you're dedicated, you're studious, you can get ahead. That's how it's socially harmonious, right? Everyone sort of agrees that we need to work hard and we'll get ahead. Well, now, what we seem to be running into, on the other hand, it contrasts with that. In fact, what ends up happening, what this scenario seems to be, is that I paid out $10, I only got $6 back, so even though that worker was willing to work for $1, right? They're hardworking, they're persevering, they're studious, they're still going to end up unemployed. Well, you can't have full employment and unemployed people. Instead, in order to make sure full employment continues, the neoclassicals needed a way to make sure that savings gets back to me. And they do that in something called the market for loanable funds. I'm going to erase these equations now. Okay. In the market for loanable funds, in the neoclassical model, the market for loanable funds is designed to make sure, this is what its function is, it functions to transfer savings from savers to investors. Okay? So remember, I paid out $10, I only got $6 back. There's $4 of savings out there. Well, what the market for loanable funds does is those people who have $4 worth of savings will put those $4 in the market for loanable funds where it is transferred from them to investors. Okay? Instead of saving it, it will be invested. So, person A, let's say person A, B, C, and D are the ones who saved $4. Okay, well their $4 will be transferred to people E, F, G, and H, who will then invest it back into my company. Okay, so it's where savings is transferred from savers to investors. That is what's done in the market for loanable funds. Okay, here I've drawn an upward sloping curve that says SS. That stands for supply of savings. Okay? Remember, this is sort of from the equation I just erased. Savings is a function of the interest rate. Okay? So the supply of savings is a function of the interest rate. Here, on the vertical axis, I have drawn the interest rate. R stands for the interest rate. Okay? I've also drawn a downward sloping curve labeled DS. That stands for the demand for savings. And the demand for savings. That comes from the equation I also just erased. Investment equals is a function of the interest rate. Okay? And this is a positive relationship, right? Savings is positively related to the interest rate, and investment is negatively related to the interest rate. Okay? So, savers are the people who come up with the supply of savings. And the demand for savings is brought about by investors, right? People demand savings if they want to invest. Okay? Finally, here on the horizontal axis, I've drawn I, S, which just stands for investment savings, right? We're going to measure the level of investment and savings on the horizontal axis, okay? One thing in economics, you should just pay attention to this over the next couple of weeks. Every single school of economic thought believes that investment is always equal to savings, okay? Whether you're neoclassical, Keynes, whomever, they all agree that investment is equal to savings. It is. What they disagree on is, do changes in savings lead to changes in investment? Or do changes in investment lead to changes in savings? Okay? You would get very different policy prescriptions from one and the other. So keep that in mind just as we go through this class. You're going to see that next time with Keynes. Okay? But for now, let's say we have our example where I paid out $10, I only got $6 back. That's an extra $4 of savings. Okay? Well, if we have an additional $4 of savings, what that does is that increases the supply of savings. Okay? The supply of savings has been increased. The supply of savings goes up. An increase of a supply makes the curve shift down and to the right. So I drew supply of savings 1. And supply of savings 1. This was our initial equilibrium, but this is our new equilibrium. Okay? When there's a higher supply of savings, right? Because now there's an extra $4 worth of savings, so we shifted the curve. With the increased supply of savings, now what has happened is that savings have become more abundant. Okay? If savings are more abundant, they are less valuable, right? So their price falls. The price of money is the interest rate. Okay? So if savings are more abundant, they're less valuable because they're more, If savings are more abundant, they're less valuable, which pushes down their price. It pushes down the interest rate. Confused myself there for a second. So what we end up getting, I just put a 0 right there. We have a new lower interest rate. Okay? The supply of savings goes up, right? We shift our supply of savings curve to the right, which has pushed down our interest rate. We were here, now we're here. Okay? The interest rate has decreased. Well, if the interest rate goes down, we know that investment is a function of the interest rate, right? We already said that if the interest rate goes up, investment goes down. But if the interest rate goes down, investment goes up. Well, here, in this particular example, the supply of savings went up, which means the interest rate went down. If the interest rate goes down, the demand for savings goes up. So we're going to slide down our demand for savings curve. Okay? When we slid down the demand for savings curve, what we're doing is we are transferring those savings, that $4, from the savers to the investors. Okay? We're transferring the $4 from the savers to the investors. That's what this graph is showing. I paid out $10, 6 of it was consumed. but that left an additional $4 of savings in the economy. That increased the supply of savings, pushed the curve down, which then lowered the interest rate. The lower interest rate encouraged people, investors, to actually take out loans for that $4. Okay? So the money was transferred from savers to investors, which caused our investment savings equilibrium to go from here to here. Okay? We are now actually investing more. Okay? So what you end up getting is, despite the fact that that A, B, C, and D saved $4, that money was actually transferred to E, F, G, and H, which means now they invested it back to me. I spent $10 on my business, right? I paid 10 people $1 each, so my costs were $10, and I received $10 back, which means there's no reason for me to fire anyone any longer, right? Previously, those savings was going to cause me to fire someone who was willing to work for $1, right? Which in the neoclassical model can't happen. We said we're always at full employment, okay? So how are we always at full employment? Say's law. Say's law says that if there is spending, if there's saving that occurs, that savings will be transferred to investors who will then spend it. Okay? So whatever I had to pay out, I now received back. So instead of firing 4 workers, I'm going to keep those workers on. Which means they were very hardworking, very studious, right? They were willing to work for $1 an hour. And they still have a job because the amount of money I paid out is the amount of money I received back. Okay? So, in Say's law, the function of the market for loanable funds is to transfer savings from savers to investors so that supply, right, the amount of money I put out, I supplied, was demanded back to me. Okay? Supply created its own demand. By me producing something, right, I gave 10 people a job. By having them supply something, there was an accompanying demand. Okay? I increased production, which then created a demand for it. Okay? That's called supply-side economics, aka Reaganomics. Reagan tried this a lot in the 80s. Didn't work all that well, but this is what Reaganomics was, at least in theory. Now you see the whole neoclassical model right here. We have the labor market, which determines employment, the production function, which determines the level of output, the quantity theory of money, which determines prices, and Say's law, which determines the level of expenditure. The level of expenditure matters because if people were to save and I didn't get all of that money back, then I would have to fire people even though they were willing to choose labor over leisure. Okay? So, finally, let's just make one last point. Say's, because this is going to come up again with Keynes and the textbook Keynesians. With Say's law, it would seem that Say's law tells us, and the neoclassicals say this, that changes in savings lead to changes in investment via changes in the interest rate. Okay, this is going to matter a lot. So if you don't understand it in the lecture, send me an email about it or something, okay? What we're saying here is that changes in savings lead to changes in investment through changes in the interest rate. What do I mean by that? When our pizza workers decided to save more, right? They saved more. So we changed savings, right? The savings was changed. We changed savings. When the savings was changed, what that did was it lowered the interest rate and caused people to invest more, okay? So the fact that more people saved lowered the interest rate and caused investment to go up. So changes in savings led to changes in investment through changes in the interest rate. Okay? Why does that matter? Well, if you believe that changes in savings lead to changes in investment through changes in the interest rate, if you want to increase investment, the natural policy would be to increase savings, right? Let's say America wanted to increase its rate of investment right now. We do. Well, if you were a neoclassical economist and you wanted to increase the rate of investment, you need to increase the rate of savings. You need to get people to start saving more money. Because the belief is, if people save more money, then that's going to lower the interest rate, right? If people save more money, that will lower the interest rate, which will cause investment to go up, okay? So you could have you get politicians out there passing bills who say, we're going to increase the savings rate of Americans, because what that'll do is lower interest rates, and that will cause investment to pick up. And then the economy will start rolling again. Okay? Well, if you're a neoclassical economist, that sounds great to you. If you're a Keynesian economist, you shudder at that. Because a Keynesian would say, savings causes cash registers to go off less. Right? There's only one way to get a cash register to go off, and that is by spending. So the only way to get cash registers rolling is by spending. Spending is the complete opposite of savings. So neoclassicals and Keynesians, whether it's textbook Keynesian or Keynes and the post-Keynesians, disagree very much on this point. Neoclassicals believe that the market for loanable funds exists and that changes in savings lead to changes in investment through changes in the interest rate. Okay? What that does is, therefore, if you believe that, then you need to get people to save more, so that will lower the interest rate, and then people can go out and invest, and the economy will pick up. If you're a Keynesian, you say, if people save more, that just means cash registers will go off less, which means even more people are going to get fired. Right? Because if a cash register doesn't go off, what do you need workers for? Okay? So, as we're going to see, this is a very contentious point. When we talk about Keynes in the next lecture, Keynesians believe that changes in investment lead to changes in savings through changes in income. Okay? Now, you don't have to worry about that for right now. It's going to be in next week's material. I'm just letting you know. Okay? But this is a very big point of disagreement. Okay? So, that's our neoclassical model. Just to wrap up again, we'll start from the bottom, go to the top. Say's law. What it does, Say's law, is it's the theory of expenditure with the two equations, okay, and the market for loanable funds. And in the market for loanable funds, savings are transferred from savers to investors. Okay? In the quantity theory of money, we say that the government controls the money supply, the velocity is constant, and the level of output is the full employment level of output. So therefore, if the money supply is changed too much, if the money supply is really expanded, then that's going to cause prices to go up a lot. Okay? The production function says that the capital stock is exactly what it should be, and we're at full employment, so therefore the economy is already making all the possible stuff it can make. And the labor market, which is responsible for employment, tells neoclassicals say that it tells you the economy is always operating at full employment because people, the labor supply, can decide whether to make a labor-leisure trade-off based upon what the going real wage is. Right? If the real wage is really high, then you'll decide to go labor. If the real wage is low, you will decide to leisure. But regardless, if you choose leisure, then you're sitting on your couch, okay? Which means you're not in the workforce, which means you cannot be unemployed. If you're not in the workforce, you cannot be considered unemployed. So therefore, anyone who's looking for a job at that particular wage rate has a job, so the economy is at full employment all the time. The economy is always at full employment, which means capitalism is a socially harmonious economic system, political economic system, in which poverty, inequality, and unemployment are the fault of the individual, right? It's only people who are choosing leisure, it's lazy people who choose leisure, who are poor, right? Anyone who's willing to work, right? They're the ones who, they're willing to work, even if the work is bad and the wage is low. But if you're willing to work, you can get ahead, okay? That's where I came up with the description of the right side of the table that we talked about in the first lecture, okay? First day of class, the first lecture. That's where I came up with that description. And as we go forward, you're going to see how that can be juxtaposed against Keynes and the post-Keynesians. The textbook Keynesians believe very much of this, okay? They just have made a few changes that should be fairly easy for you to recognize. But Keynes is completely different from this. And so that's what we're going to end up doing in our next lecture. Okay? I'm going to turn the camera off now, and then we'll start on lecture 4.